August 6, 1945. A single aircraft crosses the morning sky above a Japanese city of 350,000 people. Below, the streets are already alive. Workers heading to factories, school children gathering in yards, streetcars rolling through the summer heat. The city of Hiroshima has survived much of the war relatively unscathed. People have noticed this. Some have wondered why. At 8:15 a.m., the world changed. To understand what happened on those 2 mornings in August, we have to go back. Not just weeks or months, but to the long, brutal arc of a war that had consumed the world for nearly 6 years. By the spring of 1945, Germany had fallen. The war in Europe was over. But the Pacific was a different story. Japan had been fighting since 1937, first in China, then across an ocean. By 1945, the Japanese military had suffered catastrophic losses at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, in the skies over the home islands. But it had not surrendered. Its leadership, deeply shaped by a code of honor that treated surrender as disgrace, continued to prepare for a final battle on Japanese soil. American military planners had begun outlining Operation Downfall, a 2-phase invasion of the Japanese mainland. Estimates for American casualties alone ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million, depending on the source and the assumptions behind it. Japanese casualties, military and civilian, were projected to be catastrophic. The island of Okinawa had already shown what that fighting might look like. The battle there lasted nearly 3 months, killed over 12,000 American troops, and resulted in the deaths of over 100,000 Japanese soldiers, and somewhere between 40,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians. Meanwhile, in the desert of New Mexico, a different kind of weapon had been under development since 1942. The Manhattan Project, a vast, secret scientific and industrial undertaking involving more than 130,000 people across multiple sites, had produced the world's first nuclear device. On July 16, 1945, at a test site called Trinity, the first atomic bomb was detonated. The explosion was equivalent to roughly 21 kilotons of TNT. Those who witnessed it were stunned into silence. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of the project, later recalled a line from Hindu scripture crossing his mind: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." President Harry S. Truman, who had only learned of the Manhattan Project in full after Roosevelt's death in April, was informed of the successful test while attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany. On July 26th, the Allied powers issued the Potsdam Declaration, a formal ultimatum demanding Japan's unconditional surrender, warning of prompt and utter destruction if it refused. Japan's government did not publicly accept the terms. The decision to use the atomic bomb was made. The target list had been carefully selected. Cities were chosen that had not yet been heavily bombed, so that the full effect of the weapon could be assessed. Hiroshima was at the top of the list. It was a city of military significance, home to the headquarters of the Second Army and a major logistics hub. But it was also, fundamentally, a city of ordinary people. August 6, 1945. It is a Monday morning and the sun is already climbing in a clear blue sky over Hiroshima. At 2:45 a.m., a B-29 superfortress named Enola Gay lifted off from Northfield on the island of Tinian, roughly 1,500 miles south of Japan. Its pilot was Colonel Paul Tibbets, who had named the aircraft after his mother. Alongside it flew 2 observation aircraft, the Great Artiste, and a plane later named Necessary Evil, carrying cameras and scientific instruments. Inside the Enola Gay's bomb bay was a uranium gun-type bomb designated Little Boy, carrying approximately 64 kilograms of enriched uranium-235. The flight north was long and largely uneventful. The crew knew what they were carrying. Few spoke about it openly. Somewhere over the Pacific, Navy Captain William Parsons completed the final arming of the weapon in the bomb bay. At around 7:09 a.m. local time, a Japanese radar station detected the approaching aircraft. An air raid warning was issued over Hiroshima. But the aircraft were few in number. The radar operators counted only 3, and B-29s had passed over in small formations before, often on reconnaissance missions. The all-clear sounded at approximately 7:31 a.m. People returned to their routines. By 8 a.m., the city was fully active. Factories had opened. Students were at school. Soldiers were assembling. A trolley crossed the Ioi Bridge, the distinctive T-shaped bridge that had been chosen as the aiming point for the bomb. At 8:09 a.m., the Enola Gay's bombardier, Major Thomas Farabee, took control of the aircraft for the bomb run. The city lay clear beneath them, the sky cloudless. At 8:15 a.m. and 17 seconds, Little Boy was released. It fell for approximately 44 seconds. It detonated at an altitude of roughly 1,900 feet above the city, an airburst designed to maximize the radius of destruction. The yield of the explosion was approximately 15 kilotons of TNT. The fireball reached temperatures near the surface of the sun. The shockwave moved outward at supersonic speed. A column of smoke and debris rose miles into the sky, forming the shape that would come to define a new era. In an instant, the area within roughly 1 mile of the hypocenter, the point directly below the explosion, near the Shima Surgical Clinic, roughly 800 feet from the Ioi Bridge, was almost entirely destroyed. Buildings of concrete and steel collapsed. Wood frame structures, which made up the vast majority of Hiroshima's architecture, were obliterated or set ablaze. The firestorm that followed consumed neighborhood after neighborhood. Aboard the Enola Gay, the crew turned away and felt the shockwave hit the aircraft even from their distance. Tibbets later described it as the feeling of flak. Tail gunner Robert Caron, looking back, described the mushroom cloud rising below them and the city beneath it becoming unrecognizable. On the ground, something entirely outside human experience had occurred. People who had been in the open within a mile of the hypocenter faced near certain death. Those farther out faced burns, collapsed buildings, flying glass, fire. The city's medical infrastructure, its hospitals, its doctors, its nurses, was itself largely destroyed. Of Hiroshima's 298 doctors, an estimated 270 were killed or injured. Of 1,780 nurses, over 1,600 were killed or injured. The dead were counted imprecisely, and the counting itself took years. Estimates range from 70,000 to 80,000 people killed immediately. By the end of 1945, the total death toll, accounting for radiation sickness, burns, and injuries, is estimated to have reached between 90,000 and 166,000. Many of the dead were civilians, many were children. In Tokyo, early reports were fragmentary and confusing. Communications with Hiroshima had gone silent. A Japanese military officer dispatched to investigate could not reach the city by rail and saw, from miles away, a vast cloud still hanging in the sky. In Washington, President Truman issued a public statement. He called the weapon an atomic bomb and described it as a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. He warned Japan that if it did not accept Allied terms, it could expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. The world received this news with a mixture of shock, relief, and, in many quarters, profound unease. In Japan, the government's initial public response was muted and, in some respects, disbelieving. Military leaders struggled to comprehend what had happened. A single bomb had done what hundreds of bombers had done to other cities in conventional raids. In the Soviet Union, Premier Joseph Stalin, already committed by prior agreement to enter the Pacific War, accelerated his plans. On August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union formally declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria. Japan now faced pressure from two directions that it had never faced simultaneously. 3 days after Hiroshima, August 9, 1945, the second atomic bomb mission had been planned for around this date. The primary target was the city of Kokura, an industrial city on the northern shore of Kyushu. The backup target was Nagasaki, a port city on the western coast of Kyushu with a history stretching back centuries. One of the few Japanese cities that had maintained contact with the outside world during Japan's long period of isolation, home to a significant Christian community and the site of major shipbuilding and arms manufacturing facilities. At 3:49 a.m., a B-29 named Boxcar took off from Tinian. Its pilot was Major Charles Sweeney. The bomb aboard was Fat Man, a plutonium implosion-type device more complex in design than Little Boy, with a yield that would prove larger. The aircraft rendezvoused with its support planes over the island of Yakushima, but one of the observation planes failed to arrive at the meeting point on time. After waiting longer than planned, Boxcar pressed on toward Kokura, but Kokura was obscured. Smoke from a conventional bombing raid the night before on the nearby city of Yahata had drifted over the target. 3 bombing runs were made. 3 times the bombardier could not achieve a visual lock. Anti-aircraft fire was beginning. Japanese fighter aircraft were being scrambled. Fuel reserves, already complicated by a mechanical issue with a fuel transfer pump, were becoming a concern. Sweeney turned south toward the secondary target, Nagasaki. Nagasaki, too, was largely covered by clouds. With fuel running critically low and no clear path to return to Tinian, the crew was under extraordinary pressure. At approximately 10:58 a.m. local time, a break in the clouds appeared, not over the intended aiming point, but over the Urakami Valley, a residential and industrial neighborhood to the north of the city center. At 11:02 a.m., Fat Man was released. It detonated 43 seconds later, at an altitude of approximately 1,650 feet, above a tennis court near the Urakami Cathedral, at that moment the largest Catholic cathedral in East Asia. The yield of the explosion was approximately 21 kilotons, larger than Hiroshima's bomb, but the hills surrounding the Urakami Valley contained the worst of the blast. The city's geography, which had protected it from much of the conventional bombing of the war, now limited, though it did not prevent, the bomb's full destructive radius. The Urakami district was obliterated. The cathedral, where many parishioners had gathered that morning, was destroyed. The Mitsubishi torpedo plant, one of the primary military targets, was devastated. Factories, homes, hospitals, schools, the neighborhood was erased within seconds. The immediate death toll at Nagasaki was estimated at between 40,000 and 80,000 people. By the end of 1945, the total is estimated at between 60,000 and 80,000. The combined death toll of the 2 bombings across the remainder of the year likely exceeded 200,000 human lives. Boxcar, critically low on fuel, made an emergency landing at the American Air Base on Okinawa. Rather than attempting to return to Tinian, Sweeney later described the mission as one of the most difficult of his life, not only because of the mechanical failures and fuel crisis, but because of the weight of what had been done. On August 9th, even as Boxcar was in the air over Japan, Emperor Hirohito met with his Supreme Council in an extraordinary session in an underground bunker in Tokyo. Japan's leaders were divided. The military leadership wanted to fight on. The peace faction, led by Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo and supported by the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, Koichi Kido, argued that further resistance was now impossible. the Soviet declaration of war had shattered any hope of using the USSR as a neutral mediator for a negotiated peace. In an almost unprecedented act, Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki asked the emperor himself to break the tie. Hirohito spoke in favor of peace. On August 14th, after further deliberation and an attempted military coup by officers who refused to accept surrender, Hirohito recorded a speech to be broadcast to the Japanese people, a speech most of them would have no radio to hear. On August 15th, the recording was played on national radio. His voice, the voice of a man most Japanese subjects had never heard speak, announced the end of the war. He did not use the word surrender. He said Japan would endure the unendurable. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials signed the formal instrument of surrender. General Douglas MacArthur presided. Representatives of 9 Allied nations were present. The Second World War was over. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not fade into history quietly. They opened an argument that has never fully closed. In the United States, the dominant post-war narrative for many years held that the bombs had been necessary, that they had ended the war quickly, avoided a catastrophic land invasion, and ultimately saved more lives on both sides than they cost. Truman maintained this position for the rest of his life. Historians and ethicists have debated this claim for 8 decades. Some argue that Japan was already on the verge of surrender and that the Soviet entry into the war alone might have been sufficient to end it without the bombs. Others point to the intransigence of the Japanese military leadership and argue that only a shock of this magnitude could have broken the deadlock within the imperial government. The debate involves not just military strategy, but fundamental questions about proportionality, civilian targeting, and the moral architecture of modern warfare. What is not debated is the human cost. The hibakusha, the Japanese term for the atomic bomb survivors, carried the physical and psychological consequences of the bombings for the rest of their lives. Many suffered long-term health effects from radiation exposure. Many faced social stigma within Japan, feared by some to be contagious or genetically damaged. Their stories, told across decades, formed one of the most powerful testimonies to the human cost of the nuclear age.